Okay, let's start our class. The most of you on this call, or most of or all of you, know very well that we're at a critical moment in the history of our country. And this report you're about to hear from Chuck Park is especially timely for this moment, although not at all what you expect, even having received our mail. I encourage you to focus your full attention on what Chuck is going to say and to weigh it with calm attention. It's extremely meaningful for the present moment. And as he develops his theme, you'll see just how that's true. I would like you to weigh it in calm reflection, both as he's talking, as we discuss it. We'll have probably an hour of discussion, and after you leave this call. So with that, Chuck, please go ahead.
Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody. The theme, the paper that I wrote, which is up on the website, I think there's a link to it, is The America You Don't Yet Know. But what I want to do is to start with two current recent events in the last week, which are very important, but I think will sort of be a setup for what I want to go into. There was an article in the Axios publication on something called Schedule F. And this is an executive order that President Trump issued right near the end of his term. And what that did is redefine the definition of civil servants, which will allow him to fire up to 50,000 civil service people. That means not just the top directors of departments, but second and third tier. And this is, what they call the deep state. These guys are there forever. They have an ideology. They're anti-American, most of them. So he doesn't have to fire all 50,000. He fires 10, 20,000, and he'll send a message. But what the article goes through is the fact that there's already plans for Trump as he takes back office, hopefully in 2024, to either reissue that executive order or make it a legislative order, which will allow him to clean house. What a team around people like Kash Patel and others are doing is then operating from that perspective, because when Trump first came in, he didn't have his own independent political machine. He had to rely on people like Pence and others to advise him who should be his cabinet members and second and third tier people. And these were all establishment people who were stabbing him in the back. And Trump has learned that lesson. Just as a quick summary, because I know this was gone over by Mike Steger on Monday and an article by Bob Ingram, just as a quick summary, what this grouping is doing is they're not looking for career people who want to become diplomats and legal beagles in the Department of Justice or something. What they're doing is looking for people who are ideologically for the principles of the American system as Trump is defining it, particularly on the protectionism, tariffs, things like that. And I'm not, all the other details you can imagine. They're not looking for career people. And they also are looking for people who have taken initiative on their own, set up organizations or taken actions against the deep state faction, and have actually withstood the attacks. So, for example, one example is some of the lawyers under Governor Paxton in Texas. These guys have filed one lawsuit after another lawsuit, in this case, particularly around the immigration question and protecting the borders. But they're dedicated. They're looking for people with courage who will stand up and fight. So that's very important. And then the fact that people know that, that there's a serious move to completely eliminate this treasonous faction in the United States through a political machine. The other major development is an article in the American Conservative, where they start a discussion. I think there'll probably be more articles there's a recognition, I think, among key Republicans and conservatives and American people, for sure, that we're in the greatest economic crisis we've ever faced. That the old means of the monetarist system, the speculative system that's dominated our country, is over. And that they have to start this, if you're a serious person preparing to take over and run this country, you have to start to reevaluate what principles, what economic system will function, and the historical roots that would work with that. So this article goes through the idea of the American system of economics. It focuses on Henry Clay and his role in promoting tariffs, which is obviously a Trump policy, national bank, and that whole fight. They make, and I'm not gonna, the issue is not whether everything they say in there is perfect or not, and whether Clay was a good guy or a bad guy. He did fight for the national bank and the tariffs. But the more important thing is that discussion is going on. And I would say that this is a direct, absolute direct reflection of Lyndon LaRouche and this organization's fight over the decades, but particularly in the last year and a half. As you know, we have a petition up that says we to end the Fed and restore an American system development policy. LaRouche was known as the leading American system economist on the planet. He made 9 forecasts, he was never wrong. So we're shaping an environment, and we do know, the fundamentals of how to reorganize the US economy. And we now are seeing an openness to start that dialogue. And we're going to have to play and our supporters and our activists are going to have to play a critical role. And the new candidates that will be running will have to play a critical role in actually forcing that debate and making sure it stays on the fundamental principles, as LaRouche has improved the American system of economics. But what I would say is that while these are really important developments, it shows really important developments and shows the direction we're heading in if we continue to fight, they're not sufficient. That we can't just have courageous people who are willing to fight, right? We can't even have just courageous leaders who are willing to fight. That unless we take this to a deeper level of what were the principles that founded our country, what were the deeper principles that founded our country, what was the historical battle between two opposing, absolutely irreconcilable world outlooks of the British oligarchical system and versus the American system, which comes out of the Renaissance tradition. We won't be able to sustain, to win that fight in the short term or sustain it if we do. We have to have once people start to realize the depth of the intellectual development and of our founders and the commitment as a passion to a concept of man, which is unique in history as forming the first republic and the first economic system, which embodies that to allow us to develop our citizens as creative human beings, then you're going to fight from a different perspective, and you're not going to make mistakes, which a lot of conservatives are making now. They get sucked into variations of the British economic system, the von Hayek, von Mises, or whatever, which are wrong. They're Austrian school. They have nothing to do with the American system. So I want to go through a little bit my development of these ideas and how this occurred, because I think it's also instructive of the task before us, which is difficult. How do we get people to provoke them to think at a different level? So, I went to Boston University, and I had a professor there named Graham Lowry, and he taught history, which I really liked history even before I got to college. But what he did in his class was very, very, very unique. He said, we're going to study this particular period of history from the late 1800s to the early 1900s around a project called the Settlement House Projects. And I'm not going to tell you what the class is about. And everybody said, what? Right? And at that point, he said, look, I can give you original material. You have to go back and look for the original material. Right? And you have to, come in and we'll discuss what's going on here, go back to the original sources and find your own also. Just don't rely on what I'm providing you, Graham said. And then we'll tell me what you think's going on. And so most people hated the class. because they wanted the answers, you know, and he wouldn't give it to them. But a few of us by the end of the class realized that this whole pretense of the settlement projects, which were spawned in London, right, was that they were defending the poor, the unemployed, the downtrodden in the inner cities from these corrupt city machines who were drunkards and, you know, cronyism and everything else. They were launching campaigns to clean out and get quote unquote good government. And what was really going on? You had a freak out from the blue bloods in the United States and the British aristocratic allies of them, that the Irish political machines were taking over the inner cities and they were losing their power. And so they created a movement, quote unquote, that sounded great. But if you started to figure out what was going on behind it, it was evil. And so, you know, that process of thinking through and coming and discovering on your own is what you really need to create a quality leadership in the country. Graham used that same method himself when he dug into the connections of the factions in Great Britain who were fighting the newly formed or forming British Empire. The British Empire came into being in the 1680s, but they weren't consolidated. They were setting up the Bank of England. They were moving to consolidate their power in England, and there was a major resistance from people like Jonathan Swift and others, right? Harley, a guy named Harley, former prime minister. And what Graham did by going back and looking at the original sources, discovering the connections of these people in Great Britain to our own founding fathers was phenomenal. He wrote a book, which is again a really critical book called, probably can't see it, How the Nation Was Won. And I'm not going to go through it in detail, but it was that same method of saying there's got to be more to history, and I'm not going to take what the authorities tell me is the history of the United States. And this battle was critical. One of the key people that Swift worked with, besides in the United States with people around Washington, they were able to appoint anti-British Empire factions of governors in New York and Virginia, Spotswood, is that, you know, we were able to, at this point, to establish a beachhead against the British Empire. Now, one of the people that Swift worked with was a fellow named Godfrey Leibniz, who I want to go into a little bit more as we develop this discussion, because he was critical. Most people, if they know him at all, they know him for developing the calculus, and it was a disputed, and I'll go into that also, but it was much more than that. He was one of the key seminal figures and intellects that shaped the thinking of our early founding fathers. So hold on for a second. And then one other person actually then who actually I think was inspired by this same, you know, urge to discover the user creative minds to figure out what real history was and its relevance to today was a fellow named Phil Valenti. And he was looking into Pennsylvania and the connections there to the Europeans and others. And he came across a very important document, entitled Of the Duties of Man as They May Be Deduced from Nature. He found it in the bottom of the Philosophical Association or something like that in Philadelphia, buried down in the cellar. It had been sitting there for 200 years, right? Nobody knew its existence and nobody published it. And he began to, this was written by James Logan, who was this, came over as the secretary of William Penn, but was an intellect on his own right and played a critical role in helping found the, shape the thinking of particularly people like Ben Franklin and others. And, you know, a lot of my work that I'm putting out here was based on Valenti's work. It was extraordinary. He began to write articles on it over maybe even close to a decade, and he thought some historian would pick it up because it's such an important document. Nobody did. So he finally printed it himself, and there's a limited print. I have one of them, and you can't find it today, which is really criminal in and of itself, and we're going to have to correct that. But I want to now go through some of the what that fight was that Logan, in this document of the duties of man as they may be deduced from nature, what he defined as the actual fundamental fight for the survival of our nation. What it shows is that the United States 20, 30, 40, 50 years before the Declaration of Independence was already showing an intellectual independence because they were committed to the truth. And so this is, it's worth going through. Logan lived from 1674 to 1751, right? Now, what Logan, the dominant, as the British Empire developed in its early phase, and even before that, the oligarchies had existed throughout history. They had to have apologists for their system. And one of the key people, some of the key people that were apologists for the British Empire were Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Newton in the sciences. And the concept of Hobbes is very simple. The concept of Hobbes is that man's an animal, that there are predators, that is, dog eat dog world, man against man, and that therefore we have to have a social contract. We have to have an authoritarian government to keep people from killing themselves. And that was a justification for an oligarchy, basically. And this is the basis of all empires, basically. But this is the same thing today in the sense of the one world government apparatus. They have this conception of man, that man's an animal, and that they have to have a supreme order, a rules-based order, which will rule the world in the interest of keeping humanity from destroying itself. And I won't, they get the founding ideas. Now, people like James Logan studied Hobbes in depth and then wrote his book as part of refuting him and a few other key people that were representing this ideology. What they were steeped in was the centuries-long concept of the Renaissance. It's that human beings are distinguished from the animal by the fact that they have creative reason. That this is the idea of imago viva Dei, that every human being was made in the image of the Creator and possessed a unique creative mind, capable of discovering principles in the universe and transmitting them to future generations. And through that, you then develop new scientific and technological capacities, which allow you to act in society, act on the universe, and change it for the benefit of mankind. Actually secure the further progress of the universe itself, let alone the progress of humanity and society as a whole. That is a completely, irreconcilable world outlook to the Hobbesian world outlook, right? Completely. And this, one of the key promoters and the guy who coordinated an international battle against this new British Empire, he was vying for the prime ministership of Great Britain in the early phase around a queen called Queen Anne. And Leibniz was connected to the potential successor to Queen Anne. But he was then, through these networks in Great Britain, connected and directly himself connected to James Logan, Ben Franklin, the Mathers, the Winthrops, and all the top intellectual leaders in the United States. Leibniz promoted the concept that that distinction of the human being as a creative human being is what, when an individual makes a creative breakthrough, or you see a child make some new discovery that you've never knew before, there's a unique emotion. It's called agape, right? You can see it, you feel it yourself, a unique emotion. It's not pleasure, which is unique to the human mind, human soul. And that's what he describes as happiness. And he writes about this explicitly. Some of his key followers, a guy named Du Vatel, writes about it explicitly. And this is what was then later, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, which was the basis for Ben Franklin inserting right? The idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That superseded the John Locke concept of life, liberty, and property, which Leibniz, as a member of the British East India Company, was promoting property at that time, which meant slaves. And so this was the fundamental battle at the highest intellect, philosophical level of what was going to dominate the world, because empires, by looting and destroying human beings and treating them like animals, destroy the ability of humanity to progress. So that is what defined the fight. You also had John Locke, who basically had the idea that man is born with an empty mind, tabula rasa, and that the only thing that man knows is through their experience, what you see, feel, taste, smell, and touch. Again, this is an animal-like conception of man. And it's all based on pleasure versus pain. It wasn't just Locke that pushed that idea, but he was a major proponent of it. This is an Aristotelian idea, which again, our founding fathers and James Logan rejected wholeheartedly. Hold on for a second. So basically, I mean, I'm just simplifying this for time's sake, but what Logan says in his book is that man is born as a social being. That's why we were given language. That man doesn't just act in their own self-interest. That man will act for their children. They'll act to help others. They'll even put their life on the line for a higher principle, right? In the sense of something they think that's necessary to continue the development of humanity, and they have to fight for it and put their life on the line. That is not a pleasure-pain reaction. That's a higher concept of man as a social being. And that is, again, what's embedded is a concept in the general welfare concept of both, well, in this, if you look at it rightly, in a certain way, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Fundamental concept that we act for the benefit of others, and therefore we have to have sovereign nation state to defend those sovereign individuals, and we should work and encourage other sovereign nations to work for the benefit of their nations and have a community of principle among sovereign nations. I just want to read you one quick quote or two quick quotes from Logan, where he's directly attacking both these concepts. He says, a mind endowed with he states the Renaissance principle that man is a mind endowed with the powers of reason, which establishes his supremacy above all the irrational and every other part of known creation. Right? That man was formed for society and benevolence. He said, there is nothing in the understanding of what was, well, he said, look, he admits that human beings have a first impression of his senses, but then we're able to develop concepts, ideas, completely, not directly related to the experience itself. That man has a creative capacity to expand as he says, in the forming that man can form within himself such infinite numbers of ideas, and so very different from those first sensations, that it has appeared to the writer as if it was furnished with a capacity in itself, i.e., it's a natural law of the capacity of the mind to go beyond what you physically see, feel, taste, and smell, and touch. That he says, thus we have opened to us and are enabled to enter into, as it were, a new kind of world of ideas, of virtues, of vices, etc. Right? And so this is only a human being can do this. This is a concept that was developed very explicitly, or it was opposed by an essay by John Locke called Essay Concerning Human Understanding, that the mind is a blank slate, as I said. Now, Logan himself had studied Leibniz in depth. He had every single edition of a document called Acta Juratorium which was the publication that published most of Leibniz's works over decades. He had all but 3 of those editions, 3 years of those editions. So he knew this. When the Newton challenged Leibniz on Leibniz's discovery of the calculus, it was Logan who came to his defense and said it's certain that Leibniz, discovered this, as it's in writing in 1677 to a person he wrote it to, and Newton never even talked about it until 1687, right? So Logan himself took this same method that we were talking about earlier. He actually wrote a whole document examining Leibniz's discovery on this idea of what they call fluctuations, or the calculus. Right, so he did the work. He studied Hobbes. He said this has nothing to do with the essence of a human being and the future of humanity. He studied Leibniz and he worked it through. So it became his idea. He owned it, as they say, right? And then he took on Newton. Newton was asserted that the universe is composed of hard particles existing in a vacuum. And Logan basically refuted that by a simple little statement. He basically said, if you take all the air out of a vacuum tube, you still have light in there. So is it empty? And then he went on from that and said, can we be sure that there is no electric or elastic medium instead of obstructing or retarding motion that may be the very means of conveying it in the universe and in the vacuum tube, that there is no vacuum, right? And he basically said it would be a kind of a horror of a thought to think you have these little balls with nothing in between, that God is committed to idea of beauty, and it just doesn't make any sense. So these are, the kind of discussion, this kind of intellectual discussion and development that was going on in the 1720s, 30s, and 40s and 50s. Logan died in 1751. Logan also already saw the potential of the study of electricity. And he said 10 years before Franklin did, he said that this was a field open for speculation that, if duty pursued, may probably lead us into more just and extensive notions of our bodies and the world we live in than have hitherto been generally thought of. Now, Logan was a scientist, a philosopher, a political activist. He was a governor. He played many roles. He did agricultural studies. Matter of fact, he and a fellow named John Bartram, who became part of Franklin's, one of the founders, co-founders of the American Philosophical Society, they were studying plant life. They were using the Carl Linnaeus system that I've just developed. They were in communication with him. They actually had 2 plants that they discovered in America named after them by Linnaeus. I mean, these were people who are delving into every aspect of what affects society in science, philosophy, history, etc. They also, Logan was committed to develop other intellectual leaders. Well, it's a really funny story because on his manor, he had a guy named Thomas Godfrey who was a glazier, but he showed a real aptitude for mathematical and scientific development. And so Logan personally taught him Latin. He opened up his entire library, scientific and mathematical books in particular. And Godfrey went on within a few years actually to develop a new design to measure latitude, called the sextant. Right? When that was submitted by Logan to the Royal Society, a Royal Society member, Hadley, tried to steal it, said it was his, and that was fought. I mean, this is what the British always do. So the idea was that Logan was committed to developing an independent American intelligentsia. One of his primary proteges was Ben Franklin. As Logan was writing this book from 1735 to 1737, he had Ben Franklin, who had newly come into Pennsylvania from Massachusetts. He had him review the book, critique it, etc. In one chapter, early in Franklin's career, he had gone to Britain when he was very young, and he was starting to get sucked into the British imperialist Hobbesian world outlook. And in chapter 6 of this book, Logan attacks that by name, and to sort of warn Franklin, don't fall into that trap. So by the end of Logan's career, 1751 is when he died, he had over 3,000 volumes in his library. He dedicated that to the founding of the first American library, the Philadelphia Company Library, which was set up by Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin then, who had to pick up the mantle, but way before that, well, let me backtrack just a little bit, because when Leibniz died, his ideas were so such a threat to the growing British Empire that King George I seized all of Leibniz's writings and took them out of print. There was a grouping in the 1730s and 40s and 50s around a guy named Abraham Kestner and Lessing, who began to get access to them in the library, began to secretly translate them. These people, like Kestner, were directly in contact with Ben Franklin, and before that Logan, but later Ben Franklin explicitly. When there was one error in my report, I had said Queen Anne was a collaborator with Franklin's friend from a German individual named Munchausen. It was actually Princess Caroline. She's the one who set up the debate between Newton and Clarke, the protege of Newton. And these are the famous papers between Clarke and Leibniz. What this grouping was able to do is then to translate for the first time the book of Leibniz called New Essays on Human Understanding. It was actually then printed, I think, in 1756. And 1 year after, or 1765, 1 year after that, Franklin was over there meeting with this grouping in Germany, Kestner and Lessing and others. And that book, within 1 year of its translation, was in the American Philadelphia Library with a preface by Kestner. So our Franklin and others were not tinkerers. They weren't people just, made some random discoveries. This was a long-standing, developing intellectual commitment to the future of humanity from a unique concept which coheres with reality of man and man's relationship to the Creator and the universe and God. That is what shaped the thinking around the development of the Constitution and others. Now, Logan Franklin then began his studies in electricity in earnest. He made the breakthroughs. I'm not going to go through that, but these guys knew at the time, right, that they were bucking the dominant British oligarchy. Logan himself said, if there be no heresy mentioned in the present age, why may we not venture to question the reasonableness of asserting a vacuum as indispensably necessary to the continuance of motion? Franklin said, hey, what we're talking about here, he was at this point, is no different than Galileo. And he said, my whispers against the orthodox doctrine in private letters would be dangerous. Your writing and printing would be highly criminal. He was talking to a friend who was doing research, which was very similar to Leibniz's ideas. He says, as it is, you must expect some censure, but one heretic will surely excuse another. So they knew exactly what they were involved in. And of course, it finally led to the split. This concept of man, well, Leibniz, the most other very, very important discovery that he made was that through heat-powered machines, one man could do the work of 100. That you had a thermal dynamic process and a mean to measure human development, and that that capacity to use machines, technology, and master that would allow he redefined the concept of economics. It wasn't about money. It was about the ability of the creative mind to discover principles in the universe, right, to allow you to act on that universe to benefit mankind in the present and in the future, and make them free up their creative capacity by eliminating the drudgery of drudgery work. That you realize, and I'm going to read this because I think it gets to the point quicker. He said, through this recognition, he redefined the concept of economics. Only a society that recognized and fostered creativity within its citizenry and actively promoted the sciences, manufacturing, and infrastructure could assure human existence in both the present and the future. This was a philosophical and cultural environment that nurtured the minds of the American geniuses like Logan, Franklin, Hamilton, and inspired them to create this unique American system of economics, and to secure, establish the only successful republic in history. Now, LaRouche had mastered Leibniz by the time he was 13. And in his book called The Power of Reason, written in 1987, he says economic science was founded by Gottfried Leibniz during the period from 1672 to 1716. Leibniz designed the principles of what was later called the Industrial Revolution, known then as the principles of heat-powered machinery and more broadly as the physical economy. This was, it had a word for it, they called it cameralism. In this connection, Leibniz discovered the conceptions of technology, quote unquote, and was the first to supply a rigorous mathematical physics definition of technology. This is LaRouche writing in The Power of Reason. Leibniz's economic science was adopted by the founders of the United States and incorporated in what Alexander Hamilton was the first to name the American system of political economy. This economic system was adopted in explicit opposition to the British East India Company's Adam Smith, and was the economic policy on which our constitutional republic was founded. So I think, first of all, one of the greatest crimes that's been committed against the American people is the obliteration of this history. That's why I say the America that you don't yet know, because there's much, much more, much, much more. Franklin then took the concepts of, fostering creative development. He set up the American Philosophical Society. Members of that went on to be top artists, philosophers, botanists, dramatists, etc. Most of this is written out of the history books. George Washington was at the Constitutional Convention, would go and watch plays, classical plays in between to relax. We had classical drama here. There's much, much more, which I can't go into in this discussion. So the basic point is that this is our responsibility to not only revive this, but we have to provoke and challenge the leadership that's now developing in the United States. Particularly, I'm finding a lot of young 25 to 40-year-olds who maybe they went to war, they came back, they started a family, they had started a business, and now they're seeing it all about to be wiped away in the hyperinflation, in the complete destruction of our nation, destruction of the Constitution, no future for their children. And they're stepping up. They're stepping up in an unprecedented way that I haven't seen. I've been with LaRouche since 1973, but this is unprecedented and it's sustained. And what I referenced in the earlier part is, important in the kinds of seriousness, but it's got to go to a deeper level where they know these fundamental principles that distinguish man from the animal. This is what LaRouche went through in almost every speech, because that is the critical element for civilization's development historically. There's always been an oligarchical system, but there's all the essence of man, his soul, his creativity has been able to overcome that in particularly periods of crisis. That's the challenge now, to get people to think at that level, and therefore they won't get duped but into accepting, as we've done. I mean, look at the culture we see now, the movies, it's revenge, the music, it's victimization. We've accepted a bestialized culture, and that culture, if accepted any further, will destroy us. The value, our founding fathers understood that we had to set up a government and an economic system to foster the creative potential of our citizens through science, technology, and culture. And that is what the essence we're fighting for, right? Which I think Trump has some sense of. He's made some very amazing speeches, like when he launched the Artemis program. If we're going to put a man on the moon, man and woman on the moon in 2024, and send a probe into a station to Mars in 2028. He was giving an idea there's a whole universe out there. He referenced the Webb telescope. We have a whole universe out there waiting for our creative discovery. And there's nothing limiting us but our ability, our not understanding that fundamental fight that this country represents uniquely, and therefore is critical. We can't really save the world, reorganize the world out of the mess we're in, unless the United States takes back its sovereign control and unleashes that creative power within our own citizens to lead this nation and the world out of this mess from that perspective. So, as I say, he said, let us finish the American Revolution to secure a community of principle among nations that will unleash the creative potential of humanity on this planet. That when Americans realize that they are tasked with the joyful responsibility of restoring, protecting, and advancing that Renaissance foundation that made our nation unique in world history, the true American spirit will be rekindled on a scale that truly terrifies the British and Wall Street globalists today. And that's what we're going to do. That's what's going to lead to the ultimate defeat of this satanic, bestial world outlook of this oligarchical system, which has its hooks into both parties and into our nation. And we've got to clean it out. And I think we have the means to do it. We have a leadership that's open to it around Trump, and we have a movement, our unique movement, which is critical to make that happen and challenge people to step up and fight from that perspective. So I'm going to end it there. I don't know how long that took, but open it up for questions and see how it goes.